They can chain your hands, but they can never sell the destiny written by the moon. The old woman's whisper lingered in Evelyn Carter's mind long after the wooden wagon disappeared beyond the hills she had called home for 19 years. Heavy gray clouds drifted across the late autumn sky, casting long shadows over the winding dirt road as cold wind tugged at the loose strands of her chestnut hair. Iron cuffs rested around her wrists, not painfully tight, but firm enough to remind her that someone else now claimed ownership of every step she took. Around her, 6 other young Omegas sat silently in the wagon, each wrapped in fear too deep for words. No one cried anymore. Even tears became useless after enough miles. The merchant leading the caravan hummed cheerfully while counting the leather pouch hanging from his belt. Every clink of silver coins echoed louder than the horses' hooves. That sound was the price placed upon their futures. Evelyn lowered her eyes toward the rough wooden floor beneath her boots, tracing the worn grain with quiet determination. Her grandmother had always warned her that hope was strongest when no one believed it remained. Before dawn that morning, the elderly woman had pressed a trembling hand against Evelyn's shoulder one final time, carefully fastening the collar of her faded blue dress. "Never let anyone see your left shoulder," she had whispered. "No matter what happens." Evelyn had wanted to ask why, but the answer disappeared beneath hurried footsteps and shouted orders as strangers entered their small farmhouse. Since childhood she had noticed the pale silver mark resting behind her shoulder, shaped almost like a crescent moon surrounded by delicate lines. Her grandmother never called it a birthmark. She only called it a promise whose meaning would arrive when the right eyes finally found it. Evelyn had never understood those words. She still didn't. The wagon rolled past abandoned fields, frozen creeks, and silent forests stripped nearly bare by the season. Occasionally they passed other travelers who quickly stepped aside after recognizing the black wolf banners fluttering above the caravan. No one dared meet the guards. Eyes. The symbol belonged to Iron Fong Pack, a territory spoken of in frightened whispers across every village for hundreds of miles. Parents warned children to stay indoors whenever Iron Fong traders appeared. Travelers prayed never to cross their borders. Stories changed depending on who told them, but every version ended the same way. Once someone entered Iron Fong, they never returned unchanged. Beside Evelyn, a younger Omega barely 16 wrapped her arms around herself. "Do you think anyone is waiting for us there?" she whispered. Evelyn looked toward the endless road stretching ahead before offering the gentlest smile she could manage. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "But wherever we arrive, we still choose who we are." The younger girl's frightened breathing slowly steadied. It was a small comfort, almost invisible, yet somehow enough to soften the silence surrounding them. The merchant glanced backward and frowned, irritated that anyone still possessed the courage to encourage another. He said nothing. Evening settled across the valley as towering stone walls finally emerged through the fading light. Massive iron gates stood open beneath carved wolves with empty eyes that seemed to watch every newcomer. Smoke curled above hundreds of rooftops inside the fortress, while distant horns echoed through the cold air like warnings carried on the wind. Evelyn instinctively reached toward the collar of her dress, making certain every inch of her left shoulder remained hidden. She had no idea that beyond those gates, someone had already begun searching the kingdom for the forgotten mark she had spent her entire life trying to conceal. The gates closed behind the caravan with a deep groan that echoed across the stone courtyard, and Evelyn felt the sound settle somewhere deep inside her chest. Iron Fong was larger than anything she had ever imagined, its streets built from dark stone worn smooth by generations of passing wolves, merchants, and guards. Tall watchtowers overlooked every corner of the fortress, their banners shifting in the cold breeze beneath a sky that seemed permanently covered in gray clouds. Nothing about the place felt welcoming, yet everything moved with quiet discipline. Men and women crossed the square carrying crates, sharpening tools, tending market stalls, and preparing for another harsh winter. Life continued with steady purpose, but every face seemed guarded, as though kindness had become something too expensive to spend. The merchant ordered the young Omegas to climb down one by one before leading them toward a long stone building near the center of the compound. Inside, an older woman with silver hair and sharp green eyes stood behind a wooden table covered with ledgers. She examined each newcomer carefully, writing names beside neat columns before assigning them work. When Evelyn stepped forward, the woman paused for a heartbeat. "Name?" she asked. "Evelyn Carter," she answered quietly. The woman nodded without expression. "Laundry. Kitchens. Storage rooms. You work where you are told, and you keep your head down." Evelyn accepted the instructions with a polite nod, grateful that no one asked another question. The faded blue dress her grandmother had fastened that morning still covered her left shoulder completely, and she silently thanked every careful stitch that had kept the fabric intact. Hours passed quickly as she carried baskets of clean linens through endless hallways lined with polished stone. Everywhere she looked, she noticed signs of careful order rather than chaos. Servants hurried without speaking loudly. Guards greeted one another with respectful nods instead of harsh commands. The stories she had heard about Iron Fang suddenly felt incomplete, as though the truth hid beneath the surface where outsiders never looked closely enough to find it. While stacking folded blankets inside a storage room, Evelyn noticed a small boy struggling to lift a heavy bucket nearly half his height. His arms trembled with effort, but he stubbornly refused to ask anyone for help. Without saying a word, she walked over and lifted the bucket beside him. Surprise flashed across his face. "Thank you," he whispered. "You are welcome," Evelyn replied with a warm smile. "Sometimes carrying something together makes it lighter." The boy smiled for the first time before hurrying away. She watched him disappear around the corner, unaware that another pair of eyes had quietly observed the simple exchange from the far end of the hallway. Near sunset, the Omegas gathered inside a modest dormitory where narrow beds lined the walls beneath small windows. The younger girl from the wagon sat beside Evelyn again, wrapping a thin blanket around her shoulders. "This place is not what I expected," she admitted. Evelyn looked toward the fading orange light beyond the glass. "Neither is fear," she answered softly. "Sometimes it grows from stories. Sometimes it grows from secrets." Before the conversation could continue, a low horn echoed across the fortress. Every voice fell silent. Workers stopped where they stood. Even the guards straightened instinctively. Footsteps filled the courtyard outside, measured and confident, followed by the respectful lowering of dozens of heads. Evelyn moved carefully toward the window, keeping herself hidden behind the stone frame. She could not see who had arrived, only the edge of a long black cloak passing beneath the torchlight. Yet for reasons she could not explain, the pale mark hidden beneath her left shoulder suddenly felt warm against her skin for the very first time in her life. The warmth beneath Evelyn's left shoulder faded almost as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions. She rested her hand lightly against the fabric of her dress while the distant footsteps continued across the courtyard below. Every worker remained perfectly still until the sound finally disappeared into the heart of the fortress. Only then did conversation slowly return, carried in careful whispers that never seemed to rise above the crackling of nearby lanterns. The younger Omega beside her leaned closer. "Who was that?" she breathed. An older woman arranging blankets across the room answered without looking up. "Someone important enough that every wolf remembers their place." She offered nothing more, and no one dared ask another question. Dawn arrived beneath a pale silver sky. Frost coated the stone paths as Evelyn reported to the kitchens before sunrise. Warm bread filled the air with a comforting scent that reminded her of home, and for a brief moment she almost forgot where she was. She spent the morning carrying baskets between the bakery, the pantry, and the dining hall, quietly observing the rhythm of Iron Fang. The fortress no longer felt cruel in the way frightened travelers had described it. It felt disciplined, guarded, and strangely burdened by responsibilities invisible to outsiders. Yet beneath that order she sensed another current, something hidden that everyone seemed careful not to mention. Near midday, the head cook asked Evelyn to deliver fresh linens to the old records chamber beneath the eastern tower. The hallway leading there was narrow and silent, lit only by tall windows where winter sunlight spilled across the floor in long silver beams. As she rounded a corner, she noticed an elderly caretaker struggling to gather a stack of weathered books that had slipped from his arms. Without hesitation she knelt beside him, carefully collecting each volume before dust could settle across the faded leather covers. "Thank you," the old man said with a tired smile. Most people walk past an old servant without seeing him anymore. Evelyn handed him the final book. "Everyone deserves to be seen," she replied gently. His expression softened with quiet gratitude. As he reached for the stack, one heavy volume began sliding again. Evelyn instinctively caught it before it struck the floor. The movement pulled against the collar of her dress. She heard a small tear in the stitching near her shoulder. Her heart stopped. She immediately set the book down and pulled the fabric closed with trembling fingers. Had anyone noticed? The old caretaker seemed focused only on balancing the books, thanking her once again before disappearing into another corridor. Evelyn released a slow breath she had not realized she was holding. She quickly adjusted the loose collar and continued walking, unaware that someone standing behind an arched stone column had witnessed the brief movement. Hidden in the shadows, a tall man wearing the dark uniform of the Royal Guard narrowed his gaze for only a moment before saying nothing. His attention had not lingered on Evelyn herself. It had lingered on the faint silver glow that had flashed beneath the torn fabric for less than a heartbeat before vanishing again. By evening the guard quietly reported the strange observation to a visitor staying within the fortress. No names were mentioned. No accusations were made. Only one sentence was spoken inside the private chamber before silence returned. "I may have seen the mark you ordered us to watch for." Across the fortress, Evelyn sat beside the small window of the dormitory, carefully repairing the torn collar with a needle borrowed from another omega. Each careful stitch covered the hidden crescent once more, while beyond the glass the first stars slowly emerged above Iron Fang. She believed she had protected her grandmother's secret again. She did not know that destiny had already noticed the single moment she thought no one had seen. Morning sunlight spilled across the highest towers of Iron Fang, turning frost into thousands of tiny crystals that shimmered like scattered stars. Evelyn noticed the change the moment she stepped outside with a basket of fresh linens balanced carefully against her hip. The fortress had become unusually quiet. Guards stood straighter than usual. Servants moved with greater purpose. Even the merchants inside the central square lowered their voices as if the entire pack had agreed to honor an invisible rule. Curiosity spread quietly through the halls until one whispered sentence traveled from room to room. The Alpha King had remained inside Iron Fang instead of returning to the capital. No explanation followed. No one questioned the decision. Evelyn continued her work, reminding herself that the affairs of kings belonged far above someone like her. Yet she could not ignore the strange feeling that had settled over the fortress since his arrival. Every hallway seemed to carry an unseen current, as though something long asleep had begun to stir beneath the ancient stones. Late that afternoon, the head steward instructed every servant to prepare the Grand Moon Hall for an evening gathering. Long wooden tables were polished until they reflected the golden glow of hundreds of candles. Silver goblets lined embroidered runners with perfect symmetry. Evergreen branches decorated the stone columns, filling the room with the crisp scent of pine. Evelyn worked quietly beside the other omegas, carefully arranging folded napkins while keeping the repaired collar of her blue dress firmly in place. Every few moments her fingers instinctively brushed the fabric above her hidden shoulder, making certain not a single stitch had loosened. Across the hall, older servants exchanged cautious glances. One woman leaned toward another and whispered, "They say His Majesty requested the oldest records from the Eastern archives before sunrise." The second servant frowned. "Looking for what?" The first simply shook her head. "No one knows. Only that he has searched for years." The words lingered in Evelyn's thoughts long after the conversation ended. Searching for years. She wondered what could remain hidden for so long that even a king had failed to find it. Before she could think further, a cheerful voice interrupted her thoughts. The young Omega she had comforted during the journey smiled as she approached carrying a stack of polished plates. "I heard the Alpha King rarely visits another pack unless something important is happening," she whispered. Evelyn offered a gentle smile. "Sometimes important things arrive quietly." The younger girl laughed softly. "You always sound like someone much older." Evelyn only shrugged. Her grandmother had always believed that patience revealed truths that fear could never see. As evening settled over the fortress, the Grand Moon Hall filled with respected elders, commanders, merchants, and honored guests. Servants remained close to the walls, moving silently between the tables as music drifted through the air. Evelyn kept her eyes lowered while refilling empty pitchers, careful never to draw attention. Then the conversations suddenly stopped. Every chair scraped softly across the floor as the entire hall rose together. She felt the shift before she saw it. Slow, measured footsteps crossed the polished stone with calm confidence. Without lifting her head completely, Evelyn caught only fragments. A black cloak trimmed with silver thread. Strong leather boots. Marked by countless miles of travel. A gloved hand resting briefly against the carved back of an ancient chair. There was nothing loud or dramatic about the man's presence, yet the entire room seemed to breathe differently because he had entered. Evelyn lowered her gaze again, believing herself safely unnoticed. At the opposite end of the hall, Damian Blackwood accepted the greetings of Iron Fang's leaders with calm courtesy. Then, almost absent-mindedly, his eyes swept across the servants standing near the walls. They paused for the briefest moment upon a young woman wearing a faded blue dress whose hand unconsciously rested over her left shoulder. He did not recognize her face. He did not know her name. But for reasons he could not explain, something deep within him refused to look away. Damian Blackwood listened politely as Iron Fang's leaders discussed harvest routes, border patrols, and winter supplies, yet their voices gradually faded into the background. His attention kept returning to the quiet young woman standing near the western wall with a silver pitcher held carefully in both hands. She never searched for attention. She never interrupted another servant. She simply moved with a calm grace that felt strangely familiar, as though she carried memories older than the fortress itself. More than once he noticed her instinctively touch the collar covering her left shoulder before lowering her hand again. It was a small gesture, one most people would never notice, but Damien had spent the last 12 years searching for patterns everyone else overlooked. Across the hall, Evelyn focused entirely on her work. She refilled empty glasses, collected finished plates, and quietly thanked each guest who offered a kind word. Still, she could not shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Every time she glanced toward the high table, she quickly lowered her eyes again before meeting the Alpha King's gaze. She reminded herself that important people never noticed ordinary servants. That belief had protected her for years. Tonight, for reasons she could not explain, it suddenly felt uncertain. As the evening meal drew to a close, the pack master of Iron Fawn stood and raised his goblet. "Your Majesty," he announced proudly, "our pack wishes to honor your visit with a demonstration of loyalty and tradition." Damien nodded courteously. "You have my attention." Musicians stepped aside while several servants carried an ancient stone pedestal into the center of the hall. Resting upon it was an old silver relic shaped like a crescent moon surrounded by delicate carvings almost erased by time. The gathered guests admired it respectfully, though few seemed to understand its history. "An artifact discovered generations ago within our northern forest," the pack master explained. "It has remained silent for as long as anyone remembers." Damien's expression barely changed, but those closest to him noticed a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He had seen drawings of that relic many times inside forgotten royal records. According to ancient accounts, it was never meant to awaken on its own. It responded only to a presence connected to the moon crest. Before anyone could continue the ceremony, the head steward quietly approached Evelyn. "Bring fresh water for the honored guests," she instructed. Evelyn bowed respectfully before lifting a polished silver pitcher and walking toward the center of the hall. Every step echoed softly across the stone floor. She kept her breathing steady, determined not to draw attention. As she reached the pedestal, one of the decorative runners shifted beneath her shoe. She regained her balance immediately, but the pitcher tilted just enough for a few drops of water to fall across the surface of the ancient relic. For one silent heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a faint silver shimmer spread beneath the water like moonlight dancing across a still lake. It was so subtle that most guests dismissed it as a trick of the candlelight. Evelyn noticed it only from the corner of her eye and quickly stepped back, believing she had imagined it. The shimmer disappeared almost instantly. Around the hall, conversations resumed without concern. Yet Damien did not look away from the relic. He had seen that glow once before in a centuries-old illustration preserved beneath the royal palace. His pulse remained calm. But certainty quietly replaced years of uncertainty. Someone connected to the forgotten legend was standing inside this very room. He slowly lifted his eyes from the relic and looked toward Evelyn just as she reached for the collar of her blue dress once again, unaware that the ancient artifact had answered her presence before the first words between them had ever been spoken. The silver shimmer vanished before anyone else seemed to notice, but Damien Blackwood remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed upon the ancient relic resting at the center of the hall. For more than a decade he had followed scattered legends, forgotten journals, and fading royal records that all described the same impossible sign. The relic would never awaken on its own. It answered only to the presence of the one marked by the moon. Every search had ended with another unanswered question, another abandoned trail, another promise that history had buried too deeply to recover. Yet tonight, after years of silence, the relic had whispered instead of sleeping. Around him the banquet continued as though nothing unusual had happened. Laughter slowly returned. Musicians resumed their quiet melody. Guests lifted their glasses while discussing trade, harvests, and the coming winter. Only Damien seemed to hear the silence hidden beneath the ordinary sounds. His closest royal guard stepped beside him and spoke so quietly that no one else could hear. "Your Majesty, the servant is the same woman I reported yesterday." Damien gave the slightest nod without taking his eyes from Evelyn. "Do not approach her," he answered calmly. "Not yet." Across the hall Evelyn placed the empty pitcher onto a serving cart before releasing a careful breath. She could not explain why her heartbeat refused to settle. Nothing had happened. At least nothing that anyone had acknowledged. Still, the warmth beneath her left shoulder had returned, stronger than before, spreading gently beneath her skin like sunlight reaching through winter clouds. She discreetly adjusted the collar of her dress once more and silently repeated the words her grandmother had spoken countless times. "Never let anyone see it. Never." As the evening drew toward its close, the pack master invited Damien to examine several heirlooms preserved within Iron Fang's private collection. Together they entered a smaller chamber lined with ancient maps, ceremonial weapons, and weathered scrolls. At the far end of the room rested another artifact, a circular stone tablet carved with symbols almost erased by time. Damien stopped immediately. One section of the carving matched the faint design surrounding the crescent symbol described in the oldest royal manuscripts. He stepped closer while the pack master smiled proudly. "It has always been nothing more than decoration," the older wolf explained. Damien traced the air above the weathered carving without touching it. "No," he replied quietly. "Someone simply forgot how to read it." The words unsettled everyone in the room. Several elders exchanged uncertain glances, realizing their greatest treasures might hold meanings they had never understood. Meanwhile, back inside the servants' quarters, Evelyn helped the younger Omega fold blankets before bedtime. The frightened girl smiled shyly. "You always make this place feel less lonely." Evelyn returned the smile. "Home is not always where you begin. Sometimes it is where people choose kindness." The younger girl drifted to sleep soon afterward, leaving Evelyn alone beside the narrow window overlooking the moonlit courtyard. She stared toward the pale moon hanging above Iron Fang, wondering why it suddenly felt so familiar. Far below, Damien crossed the courtyard on his way back to the guest residence. Almost without thinking, he looked upward. For a brief second their eyes met through the distance separating the tower window from the stone path below. Neither moved. Neither spoke. The moment lasted no longer than a single heartbeat before Evelyn quietly stepped back into the shadows, believing she had simply looked at a stranger. Damien remained where he was, calm but certain of one thing he had not allowed himself to believe for many years. The legend he had been chasing was no longer hidden somewhere beyond the kingdom. It was already living beneath the same roof, completely unaware that destiny had finally found her. The following morning arrived beneath a sky washed in pale blue, and the fortress seemed almost peaceful after the long evening of quiet celebration. Evelyn welcomed the familiar rhythm of simple work because it gave her mind somewhere safe to rest. She carried baskets of freshly folded blankets through the eastern corridors while sunlight poured across the stone floors in long golden ribbons. The strange warmth beneath her left shoulder had finally faded, yet the memory refused to leave her. She could still remember the Alpha King's calm eyes lifting toward the tower window the night before. There had been no anger in them, no judgment, only a quiet certainty she could not understand. She convinced herself it had meant nothing. After all, a ruler responsible for an entire kingdom would never have reason to remember an ordinary servant. Across the fortress, Damien Blackwood stood inside the ancient records chamber surrounded by shelves filled with weathered journals, faded maps, and forgotten family histories collected from every major pack. One fragile manuscript rested open before him, its brittle pages marked with illustrations almost erased by time. An elderly royal historian carefully turned another page before stopping beside a drawing that immediately captured Damien's attention. It showed a crescent surrounded by delicate silver lines identical to the descriptions preserved in the royal archives. Beneath the illustration, written in elegant handwriting centuries old, appeared a single sentence. The moon crest does not awaken strength. It awakens harmony. Damien remained silent for several moments. For years many had believed the legend promised unimaginable power, yet the oldest surviving record suggested something entirely different. The chosen bearer was never meant to conquer kingdoms. The bearer existed to restore balance when fear divided the packs. The realization explained why every trail he had followed had seemed incomplete. People had spent generations searching for a weapon when the prophecy had always spoken of a healer. Meanwhile, Evelyn received a new assignment helping organize supplies inside a small infirmary overlooking the western gardens. Shelves lined with herbs, clean cloth, and glass bottles filled the room with the gentle scent of cedar and lavender. An elderly healer welcomed her with a grateful smile. Most people hurry through this room because they believe there is nothing important here, the woman said while arranging dried plants into careful bundles. They forget that healing keeps every fortress standing long after swords are put away. Evelyn smiled warmly. My grandmother used to say almost the same thing. Together they spent the afternoon preparing simple remedies for the coming winter. At one point a frightened stable dog wandered into the room with a small thorn caught between its paw pads. The animal hesitated at first, but Evelyn slowly knelt, speaking softly until it relaxed enough to let her remove the thorn. The dog wagged its tail happily before trotting back outside. The elderly healer watched the quiet exchange with thoughtful eyes. Animals trust hearts before words, she said gently. They always have. Unknown to either woman, Damien had crossed the garden outside while meeting with Iron Fang's senior counsel. Through the open window he happened to glance toward the infirmary at the exact moment the dog rested peacefully beside Evelyn's feet. The simple scene stirred another memory from the ancient manuscript. The chosen one would calm what fear could not. No miracle filled the room. No light appeared. There was only effortless kindness, so natural that Evelyn herself never realized it was unusual. As sunset painted the fortress in soft shades of gold and amber, Damien quietly closed the weathered manuscript. Piece by piece, the scattered fragments of a forgotten prophecy were beginning to fit together. He still lacked the final proof, but his certainty continued to grow. The young woman protecting a mysterious mark beneath her shoulder possessed something far rarer than power. She carried the quiet gift the kingdom had almost forgotten how to recognize. By the next morning, the quiet rhythm of Iron Fong had changed in ways Evelyn could feel but could not explain. Messengers crossed the courtyards with unusual urgency, council members disappeared behind closed doors, and royal guards quietly expanded their patrols without alarming the residents. Nothing appeared dangerous. If anything, the fortress felt even more orderly than before. Yet beneath the calm surface, important decisions were clearly unfolding. Evelyn continued helping inside the infirmary, arranging fresh herbs along the shelves while the elderly healer sorted dried flowers into small linen bags. "The air feels different today," the healer observed with a thoughtful smile. "Sometimes change arrives before anyone knows its name." Evelyn nodded softly. "My grandmother used to say the wind always carries tomorrow before people do." The older woman looked at her with quiet affection. "Your grandmother must have been a remarkable teacher." Before Evelyn could answer, a royal messenger appeared at the doorway. He bowed respectfully to the healer before speaking. "His Majesty has requested that every person working within the fortress gather in the Grand Moon Hall this afternoon." No explanation followed. The messenger simply bowed once more and continued down the corridor. As the hours passed, whispers spread through Iron Fong. Some believed the Alpha King was preparing to announce new agreements between the packs. Others expected changes to the winter trade routes. No one guessed the truth because no one imagined the forgotten legend could be standing among the servants carrying folded blankets and baskets of bread. When the afternoon sun reached its highest point, the Grand Moon Hall slowly filled once again. Leaders, merchants, healers, guards, servants, and workers stood together beneath towering stone columns illuminated by streams of golden light. Evelyn quietly joined the other Omegas near the back of the hall, hoping to remain unnoticed as always. Damian Blackwood stepped forward with calm confidence, allowing the room to settle into complete silence before speaking. "For many years," he began, "our kingdom has searched for strength in the wrong places." His steady voice carried effortlessly through the hall. "We believed greatness belonged only to power, titles, or bloodlines. We forgot that the strongest foundations are often built by hands no one thinks to notice." Many listeners exchanged uncertain glances, wondering where his words were leading. Damien continued. "The oldest records preserved by our ancestors teach something different. They tell us that true leadership restores hope before it demands loyalty. It heals division before seeking victory." Evelyn listened quietly, surprised by the warmth she heard in his voice. These were not the words she expected from the ruler whose name inspired respect across every pack. Then Damien's eyes slowly moved across the gathered crowd until they rested upon her once again. He did not call her forward. He did not expose her secret. Instead, he addressed everyone equally. "Look around this hall," he said. "Every person standing here carries a story invisible to others. Before judging what someone appears to be, remember that destiny rarely announces itself with a crown." The room remained completely still. Evelyn lowered her eyes, unaware that his words had been spoken for her as much as for everyone else. As the gathering came to an end, people quietly returned to their duties, carrying the Alpha King's unexpected message into every corner of the fortress. Damien remained near the front of the hall until almost everyone had left. Only then did he remove a small folded parchment from inside his cloak. It contained the final missing page copied from the ancient manuscript that morning. Across its faded surface, one sentence had been preserved more clearly than all the others. "The moon chosen shall reveal the crest only by her own free will, for destiny cannot be uncovered by force, only by trust." Damien carefully folded the parchment once more, realizing that after 12 years of searching, the final step had never belonged to him at all. It belonged entirely to Evelyn. 3 nights later, the full moon rose above Iron Fong, bathing the ancient fortress in soft silver light that seemed brighter than anyone could remember. The entire pack gathered in the central courtyard for the traditional moon blessing, a quiet ceremony held at the beginning of every winter. Evelyn stood near the back beside the other servants, hoping to disappear into the crowd as she always had. She believed the evening belonged to the Alpha King and the leaders of the great packs. She never imagined it would change the course of her own life. Damian Blackwood stepped onto the circular stone platform beneath the open sky and looked across the hundreds of faces waiting in respectful silence. His voice was calm, yet every word carried through the courtyard with effortless clarity. For generations, we believed destiny could be claimed through power. We searched for greatness in bloodlines, titles, and victories. But the oldest promises of our ancestors tell a different story. The moon chooses hearts before names. His words settled over the gathering like the quiet snowfall that had begun drifting through the night air. Then Damian slowly descended from the platform instead of remaining above everyone else. The crowd instinctively stepped aside as he walked through the center of the courtyard without hesitation. No one understood where he was going until he stopped directly in front of Evelyn. She looked up in surprise, convinced he must be searching for someone standing behind her. There was no one else. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Damian simply offered a warm, reassuring smile that carried neither command nor expectation. "Evelyn Carter," he said gently, speaking her name for the first time. "You have spent your life protecting something because you believed the world would fear it." Her heart raced. "My grandmother told me never to let anyone see it," she answered almost in a whisper. Damian nodded with quiet understanding. "She protected you until the day you could choose for yourself." Around them, the courtyard remained completely silent. There was no pressure in his eyes, only patience. Evelyn closed her eyes for a brief moment as memories of her grandmother returned with perfect clarity. Never let anyone see it until the right eyes find it. Slowly, with steady hands, she loosened the collar of her blue dress just enough to reveal the small silver crescent resting upon her left shoulder. The mark shimmered beneath the moonlight, not with overwhelming brilliance, but with the same gentle glow that had awakened the ancient relic days before. A soft silver light spread across the stone courtyard, illuminating the weathered carvings beneath everyone's feet. The old symbols surrounding the platform responded one after another until delicate lines of moonlight formed a complete circle around Evelyn without harming anyone or startling the gathered crowd. Elderly historians lowered their heads in astonishment. The royal guards exchanged silent glances of recognition. The oldest healer smiled through quiet tears. Damian stepped forward and, instead of standing above her, respectfully bowed his head. "The legend was never about ruling others," he said. "It was always about restoring what fear tried to erase." Evelyn looked around the courtyard and saw something she had never expected. No one looked at her with suspicion. No one looked at her with pity. They looked at her with hope. The warmth beneath her shoulder disappeared at last, replaced by a peaceful stillness that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. Snow continued falling softly as Damian straightened and placed a white cloak embroidered with a silver crescent across her shoulders. "No chain can own what the moon has already chosen," he said. Under the quiet light of the winter moon, Evelyn finally understood that she had never been defined by the day she was sold. She would always be remembered for the day she chose to step forward without fear, proving that true strength is gentle, kindness leaves the deepest legacy, and destiny often arrives disguised as the quietest soul in the room.